Recording is in progress. Thanks everyone for coming and hanging out tonight. We've got Pat Santora here to give a talk about Amazon Web Services. Thank you very much for joining us, Pat. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come talk to us. The floor is yours, my friend. Go for it.
Awesome. It's good to be here. I don't know many of you, so appreciate the intro and having me come on and talk. What I have is a small agenda, some things to cover, but really this can kind of turn into kind of a talk about like what's possible at AWS, things along those lines. So let me kind of give a quick intro about who I am and what I do here at AWS, kind of set the tone. So I'm a solutions architect manager in the startup segment. So basically my job is to help solutions architects align and work with customers that are in startups. So think customers that are of low spend to moderate spend and need to understand like how to modernize in the cloud, hit pain points, get support, talk about their workloads, unpack where they're going for the next 6 to 12 months and so on, and help them evangelize like what's possible, share services, best practices, things along those lines, connect them to specialists and all that great stuff. So I've been here at AWS for about 3 years, about 35 years of technical experience, working in startups and big organizations. And here at AWS, I've been an IC, which is called an individual contributor. And that is an SA that actually works with customers and gravitated to management position. So here to talk about a little bit about some of what AWS does, maybe some of the things that we do in startups that's a little unique, and then potentially just kind of open the floor and talk about some of the services that are very commonplace at AWS that a lot of our customers use to kind of help build into the cloud. And this goes from anything from compute, simple 3-tier architectures like an API, database, front-end design for mobile work or for a website that's hosted in a CDN, to analytics and machine learning. So pleasure to meet you all. Does that sound good to you all to jump into?
Works for me.
Awesome. Okay, so I have a couple of things. First,
synchronized replicas provisioned in different availability zones. So in the region.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I took care of it.
All right, cool. So who here, and do a thumbs up, who here uses AWS right now? Just curious. Okay, cool. So I'll do a little bit of history, a little bit of what AWS does. But one final question, is anybody using any other cloud providers like Azure or Google or anything for their applications for hosting or anything like that?
Just old brick and mortar mom and pop hosting services for anything that's not on AWS.
Yep.
I'm originally an Azure guy, so I've been dragged kicking and screaming to the AWS world since joining Adobe. So it's been weird, and now I'm learning about Google. So yeah, I'm in all three.
Nice. So the premises of cloud is basically building out a environment where you can turn things on and off very quickly in a moment's notice. And we like to talk about at AWS, think about a utility type of situation where you're flipping a light switch on and turning it off. In this case, you're turning on a server, you're using it, and you're turning it off. There's no need to actually buy hardware. You don't have to worry about any of that. You basically can turn on an instance, a database, whatever makes sense for a testing or a workload. And then once you're done, you can just, again, turn it right back off. And you basically follow what we call a pay-as-you-go model. So you are paying for what you use, basically how much time you're actually using the solutions that we have. So if you're ever needing to do anything like in a startup world or product-wise, you need to host it, cloud, it could be a really great environment because you don't have to worry about, again, getting that hardware, going to maintain that hardware or anything along those lines. Instead, you can kind of set things up in the cloud, okay? So I'll go through a little bit of a general architecture. I'll just kind of talk through it real quick. I don't have any slides. I want to kind of keep this kind of a free-flowing conversation. Again, happy to answer any questions that you may have. But basically, when a customer comes in and wants to build something, they first start looking at our compute layers. We have a number of different compute layers, but the one that's primarily used the most is EC2. And EC2 are basically virtual machines. So you can stand up a virtual machine that has 2 CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM, or 4 CPUs and 16 gigs of RAM, and so on and so forth. There's a variety of different type of virtual machines that you can stand up. Now, once those machines are stood up, you can log into them like you would a server. You can install software such as Python, Node.js, anything you want to run like your API against, or even databases such as MySQL or PostgreSQL or MS SQL Server, whatever whatever need that you have for your product. And then you can host it there and again, use it. And then once you're done, you can turn it off and just pay for that time that you've had it used. So a lot of customers who come in, especially with startups, will start working within a EC2 environment to stand up their workload. But then as they mature, they start wanting to use other services. They're thinking about resiliency. They're thinking about elasticity. Resiliency is if something goes down, it stays up someplace else. So think like disaster recovery. Elasticity is if more users come in and use the product, then it needs to scale. Right now you may stand up a very small instance for your workload, and then tomorrow, thousands of people could start using it. And if that happens, we want to make sure the hardware that you've procured is able to elastically scale. So we have such solutions as what we call auto scaling that allows you to recognize how much traffic is coming in and how much server utilization is happening at any given moment. And then it will scale up additional instances alongside that original one to handle your workload. So different type of elasticity approaches that we have available here. I'll stop there. I'm going to take this kind of step by step, but any questions about EC2 or anything along those lines? If folks that are using EC2 share like a workload that maybe you've done that shows a success.
Well, I will probably have too many questions.
Okay.
So I'm going to try to be quiet so other people can ask them.
Yeah, I'll wait until we're eating tacos somewhere, Pat. So
sounds good. Okay, so we have our EC2 layer. That's, consider a 3-tier environment, right? We have our front end, we have our API layer, we have our database layer. I just talked about the middle layer, and can also be the first layer. If you want to host a website on like WordPress or something along those lines, you can host it on a virtual machine and you can have your API, which is there, and you also have your front end, which is there. The next step is talking about your database and like where you're storing content. When we talk about like WordPress, for example, you're going to be building in posts and different type of entries there. Those have to be stored somewhere. So we have solutions such as relational database service, which can stand up MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, MariaDB, MS SQL Server, and a few others that can go ahead and help you manage that lift so you don't have to. And what I mean by that is that you don't have to worry about standing up a server. You basically go ahead and say, this is how much compute I need, and this is the database engine that I want. And then from there, it'll stand itself up, and then you would literally connect over to it. So you'd then have an EC2 instance, you'd have an RDS instance, and you connect the EC2 with WordPress, for this example, over to your database. One of the great things that our managed services have are the resiliency aspect. So downtime, right? It's a big thing for our customers. We want to make sure we're up as long as possible. One of the things RDS comes with is what we call multi-AZ deployments. And at AWS, we have what we call regions and availability zones. We have edge locations as well, but the common ones that you're going to hear the most of are regions and availability zones. Regions are like a collection, it's a collection of co-location facilities in a given location in the world. So here in the United States, we have them in Oregon, we have them in San Francisco, we have them on the West Coast, and then we also have regions that are on the East Coast. And the idea there is that you can now put your workload as close as you need to your customer. Now, the multi-AZ approach that I was mentioning, because a region has multiple availability zones, an availability zone is basically a collection of co-location. So you have a region, you have a availability zone in that region, there are multiple availability zones in that region, and in that availability zone, you have different colo facilities, okay, to keep resiliency at form front. Now, when you do the multiple AZ, you can stand up a database that is in two regions, two availability zones. So if availability zone goes down, your database is still up, right? So you get that level of resiliency that you're looking for. So that is a general model and how we as AWS can actually bring up and give you a resiliency aspect, elasticity aspect, and whatnot on a very common level with like WordPress and the database. Now, let's say that expands. You want to do more. You want to be able to now host assets in such a way that it can scale to all of your customers without impacting your actual server. So again, in WordPress, you can have images, you can have photo booths, you can have all sorts of stuff that you may want to store that can be delivered from WordPress. We have a solution called S3, which is simple storage service. And that is a static data store. So object files, a image, a video, a document, you name it, that's what can live there, okay? We also have what we call a CDN, and that is basically CloudFront. And CDN basically gives you the ability to cache files at the edge. So what we do with S3 and CloudFront is we use them together, storing those images into S3 and then fronting it with CloudFront. And then when you have your WordPress environment and you're then clicking on links, instead of actually pulling them from that server and giving that server that load, you're focusing them to get that image from CloudFront instead. So it allows, again, better elasticity and better resiliency and allows you to scale even more. So as you grow here at AWS, there's different layers that solutions architects like myself and the people that I work with will help you to understand how to stand those things up so you can be elastic and go forward from there. Any questions about that?
Sure. How is it, so how would we go about like booking time with a solution architect, and when is the right point in time to do that when we're setting up an AWS environment?
That's a very good question. So normally solutions architects work with customers in AWS that are of certain spend, and then moving forward from there. Outside of that, we work with other customers, whether you come to Loft events and we talk to you and things along those lines, that's another way of that it can be done. There isn't a exact one-on-one approach. We do have this solution called Repost, and basically Repost gives the user the ability to ask questions. I want to do X, I'm having trouble with Y. And then a solutions architect will come in there and then be able to give you prescriptive guidance back on what you need to do. Solutions architects are normally dedicated to customers that have certain amounts of spend at the moment. But there, again, are mechanisms that are there that can help you at least reach out, ask questions, and get prescriptive guidance.
And what is Repost? Is that like a chat room or something? Or?
It is a website. Think about it as like almost like a Stack Overflow. Here, I'll put in a link here so you can kind of take a peek. Let's see. There you go. I put it in the messaging. So basically, if you go to Repost, you'll see a collection of different topics. And then you can go in, see what others have asked, find the answers of what you're looking for. And if you don't find the answer, you can ask a question. And then a solutions architect will come behind, or a specialist, and help answer that question for you.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. So we do work with different layers of individuals and companies. So we work with early engagement customers. So think about, if all of you are familiar with Techstars or Y Combinator, those are mechanisms where if you're thinking about a project that you'd like to build, you can go pitch. And if you're selected, you'll get credits. And some of those credits can be applied to an AWS account so that you can go ahead and get something spun up. And solutions architects are also there, so they can help you kind of get an understanding of what's going on. You'll connect with a business development person that'll help you kind of understand a little more of the business at AWS and so on and so forth. So there are ways of coming in to be able to get hands-on experience or hands-on understanding of what's possible. But I would definitely look at Repost as definitely one of the ones and mechanisms that you can use to at least ask several questions if you want to know kind of what's going on. So after we just talked about the WordPress aspect, that's a very common place, right? It's a very common workload that's set up in AWS. It could be just an API. I mean, you name it. It's really up to you at this point. We give you the hands-on approach to go ahead and build what you need. From that point, as your product expands and grows, you're going to want to start thinking about how this can be measured. So analytics, machine learning, things along those lines. You want to see how many customers are actually using the system and from where. So if you have a lot of folks coming from the West Coast, and you also have a lot of folks coming from the East Coast, then, and you're hosted only in the West Coast region, then that's something that you may want to look at to expand your infrastructure to be on both regions. And that gives you that, again, that extra resiliency so that you can go ahead and be in 2 regions instead of 1. So we have tools in place that help you gain traction to see like where your traffic is actually coming from. And then we could also talk through like how you can copy over and build your environment in 2 regions. That leans into what we like to call, and I think many here know about, is infrastructure as code, IAC. And infrastructure as code are using solutions such as Terraform. What we have here is called CloudFormation. Another one is called Cloud Development Kit. And these are mechanisms where you basically are writing code or scripts that basically help stand up the services, the instances, the database, the things that you would need in the cloud. And the reason why you do that with IAC is if you have to go into another region, you can take that same script, modify it slightly, and stand up the exact same thing in the other region without doing any manual work as a human. It basically ensures that you're not losing touch with what you have and forgetting something down the line as you're maturing a product in one location. Instead, now you have it just templatized so you can use it elsewhere. Now, as you expand again, back to analytics, we can work with other solutions that we have here at AWS, help you understand what's going on with your workload. A lot of logging ends up happening with our systems, right? You build an application, you want to log traffic, you want to see what people are doing, and you want to bubble all that kind of stuff up, right? So that can either live in a database, it can live in a time stream solution or a time database, time series database. Really up to you. We have services for both. But once it's there, you want to be able to then take that data and curate it. You want to minify it. You want to be able to see really and hyper focus on how many in certain demographics are doing certain things and things along those lines. And we have solutions here that do that too. For instance, one is called AWS Glue. And AWS Glue is used to reach out to data stores, whether it's information in S3, information in the database, or other type of data stores. And then it'll help you curate that data and bring it down to a smaller figure, which then you can save elsewhere. So it is a managed solution. You're not standing up instances. You're using it as a pay-as-you-go model where you're running a workload that pulls in content. You can put script in, such as like Python and other type of language, and be able to minify it down and then save it to another data storage. So think about like a ETL type pipeline where you're taking data and you're curating it and you're moving it to another location. Once that's done, you can then visualize that data. So we have a solution called QuickSight. And QuickSight is similar to, I'm blanking on the name, but think about a dashboard. So you have a dashboard where you can put in visuals, pie charts, line charts, tables of data, things along those lines that you can back to that data that you've now stored and then visualize like what's going on in a more aggregate manner. So you can kind of keep track of like what's happening with your customers, what's happening in these aspects of your application, you know, things along those lines. Those are also available here. And it gives you a nice then purview of like how many customers are coming in over time. Because maybe you have an event that's happened and you want to be able to capture how many new people have come to my site. What have they been doing in that site and things along those lines. So we have tools for that. Obviously, there are third-party tools that do this as well, but we do have also these tools at AWS, so you can kind of bubble those things up. From that point, as you get really large, so think going to enterprise, you may have a tremendous amount of data, sometimes terabytes or even petabytes of information. And it's really hard to be able to sift through all that and find different type of angles to look at that data. And that's where we have things like machine learning. So we have a product called SageMaker. And SageMaker, for those who are familiar with machine learning, is a notebook environment. So think of a Jupyter notebook, and basically in that you can build a Python page, it's a script that goes step by step of tasks and steps you want to take, such as step 1 is go ahead and pull content from S3. Step 2 is I want to clean the data. I want to remove certain columns from that data. Step 3 is going ahead and curating that data against maybe a ML model of some sort, or a machine learning library like MXNet or PyCharm or something along those lines. And it'll give you prescriptive outlook to see, like, here's a best guess or a very well-formed guess based off of the data you've provided me. And then you can then take that data and just predict a little bit more about what your customers are more interested in over a period of time. So you may take 2 years, 3 years of information, for example, put it through this solution, and it'll help predict potentially what the next year might look like based off of the history that's happened in your application so far. So a lot of steps, all very, very important, but many of them are managed services that we have here at AWS. So you don't have to stand those things up yourself. You don't have to run them locally on your workstations. You can spin up these environments, do what you need to do, and then bring them back down. So I'll stop there real quick, again, see if there are any questions. And then what I'd like to do is I can go around a couple of the services that a lot of our customers use that are mobile bound and things along those lines that can help you kind of get an understanding about, again, what's possible with a light lift without even about standing much up at AWS. So any questions?
We don't have that many people in here. If you want to just unmute yourself and ask a question, I think we'll be okay. And I'll jump in and monitor that more closely if need be. But yeah, anybody have a question for Pat?
It's a virtual environment. Sometimes it's hard to get questions answered.
Right. I have a couple of them. Here's what we have one in the chat for you. Wesley asked, oh, nope. Wesley just said, I'm just listening since I know a little bit about AWS. Okay, very good. Thanks for joining us, Wesley. I had a couple questions for you, Pat. So with back to the analytics products that you mentioned. So like, just for point of reference, how much of what the analytics do would you say is the same as what, say, Google Analytics does? Like, do they complement each other, or would you like use one instead of the other one, maybe?
So Google Analytics is a great solution when you want to get started with analytics in general and just get a kind of general purview of what's going on. Google Analytics helps out really well there very quickly. But when you want to dive deeper into fine-grained understandings about data, you sometimes need to come away from something like Google Analytics, and you need to be able to hyper-focus on the data that you currently have stored. So like with Google Analytics, you're sending events across, you're doing this type, you're just sending bits of information over to Google Analytics to help it better understand like what's going on. But sometimes you need to look at the data that you have in your environment. Sometimes you need to hyper-focus on what customers are doing, depending on the purview that you have angles in to see that information. And that's where these other tools that I mentioned at AWS come in, so that you can actually look within your databases with your pure data that you have, not the events, and be able to take that data and then make better sense of like what's going on and moving all those things forward. So we have solutions like that. We also have what we call Redshift, which is a Postgres database on steroids. So it uses basically the Postgres engine, and it has a lot of added value to it, and it's able to run in petabyte scale. And it has a very clustering approach to the data. And a lot of customers, what they'll do is they'll use it as a data warehouse. So there is a database, which is general storage of information. But then when you start getting to large scales of data, you need to start thinking about a data warehouse. And that's where that can live. And that is considered an analytics tool, because you're actually putting a large amount of data there that other analytics solutions that we have can work within, such as even machine learning. So like I mentioned, SageMaker can port information directly from Redshift to actually do some type of major analysis against and things along those lines.
Okay, cool, thank you. Kind of related to that, there are so many AWS services available, and it seems like every time I turn on my laptop, they've launched 10 new ones. What is a good website to go to, Slack channel, something? What do you recommend for like keeping abreast of the new AWS stuff without feeling overwhelmed by getting just hit with 87 new things every time I open a web browser? Like, is there a way to see, like, I build these kinds of web apps and I do these types of things with my development stack. Here are the 9 AWS platforms that are helpful to me. And then it just kind of filters out stuff that maybe I would never actually need for that kind of workflow.
That's a very good question. And I'm not thinking of a landing zone specific to that. Normally, what we end up encouraging folks to do is utilize Google and then be able to search for the type of thing that you're wanting to build. And there are a number of blogs, there's a number of videos that are built that actually help walk you through like what an architecture can look like. So you can easily find a blog for a three-tier architecture or some type of genomics work or HCLS or healthcare and life science or machine learning approach. And then that will give you a technical walkthrough about how to put those things together.
Okay.
Because we have services that are all meant to be stitched together based off of what your needs are. No one or two solutions could be the same. So it really comes down to helping you understand, what is available in AWS in the sense of how you would approach a workload, and then being able to evangelize with you to say like, go look here, go look there, and so on and so forth. Or if you happen to hear like, can I do machine learning in AWS? You do a search and you come up with SageMaker, and then it'll give you some examples of how you can do some basic modeling in there and things along those lines. So nothing that necessarily comes to mind, but that is a good point to
Fair
have
enough.
something there that helps with that.
Okay. And then I had one last question, and we can move on next thing if that's okay with you. So the big concern I have had, and I know lots of other folks have had about moving to a service like AWS is when we use a traditional hosting outfit, it's X dollars a month flat fee. And when we go to something that's more cloud-based, it's like, well, it's X cents per month based on how much traffic you get. And then the concern is always the surprise bill at the end of the month of like, what happened? Oh, I forgot to turn off an EC2 instance, and now I have a bill that I thought was going to be $20. It's 10 grand. I know that's been historically a concern people have with cloud services like this.
Yeah.
What's the current status of that kind of thing with AWS? And I apologize if I'm putting you on the spot with this, but like, are there any easy ways to prevent that from happening if people want to just log in and try out setting up some AWS things, and while they're still getting stuff configured, make sure that they don't accidentally end up with a bill for 10 grand at the end of the month?
Yep. So that has happened. There's a couple of ways to approach that. The first is we do have a AWS calculator, which you can go in, and I can share it here as well. And basically what you do is you say, let's see, let me pull it up here and share it. And basically what you can do is if you need to have a service or an EC2 instance stood up, you can basically go here and just choose the size that you need and the amount of space that you may need. And then it'll go ahead and give you a price point of how much that will cost month over month. So, or even yearly. So you can kind of get at least an idea of what those costs are. Because what's happened is some customers come in and they turn an instance on that's way too big. It's just way too big. And they're coming in thinking that they're going to get a lot of traffic and being able to use that instance. And they're finding that they have an idle time at this point where they're not able to actually use that instance to its full potential. Okay. And then we talk to them about right sizing. We look at their workload. We see how much their CPU has looked, now how much traffic has been going through for a period of time. And if it's too high or too low, then we'll talk to them about downsizing their instance and get them right sized to one that makes more sense. And that will help you save. So be careful on not to get an instance in that's too high. Use something like the AWS calculator to see like what that cost would be before you jump in. And then you should be in pretty good shape, at that point. The most that'll end up happening is if you don't have elasticity enabled. So I talked about auto scaling briefly, where you can do that horizontal scaling. If that's not turned on, what'll happen is your EC2 instance will just, if there's too much traffic, will just get overloaded. And that'll be a permanent blocker for your growth and spend, because you're paying for the CPU utilization and the period of time that for each hour that or minute that time that server is up. And that's what you're really going to get. You're going to get charged for. If you do auto scaling, for example, and all sorts of traffic, you get a DOS attack or something along those lines, and it just starts scaling out of control, then your auto scaling can stand up 10, 20, 30 more instances for a period of time. And that will increase that spend dramatically, right? So that's just a common thing to think about. There are two other things that you can do. First and foremost is we have a solution called AWS Budget. And what that allows you to do is you can turn on a budget alert to say if this environment is going too high in spend, if this service is going too high in spend, send me an alert so that you can go and redact and figure out like what's going on, turn off an instance, see what's happening before it gets to that end of the month. So you can basically get an alert in that capacity. Additionally, you can put alerts on for the actual instance itself. So you can watch CPU, you can watch RAM utilization, you can watch traffic utilization. And if any of those hit a certain watermark, you can actually get an alert as well. If it goes under a watermark, you can get an alert as well. So these are ways that the system can be proactively letting you know of its health and what's going on to kind of keep you at least in the guardrails to making sure your solution is always up and running, or if it's not, if it's about to tip over, what's going on. And in conjunction, if it starts scaling over and over again, you'll get alerts. It's scaled up an instance, it's scaled down an instance, and so on and so forth. So if you get a DOS attack and you have auto scaling on, you're going to know if it's starting to creep up immediately because those watermarks are getting hit.
Immediately, as in before I get billed at all for the X minutes or hours of a DOS attack that were like pegging my server, and like.
So you're going to get charged by the amount of time that you have an instance up until you rectify it. So at AWS, we do what we call the shared responsibility model. We take care of the physical security of the infrastructure, and we give you the tools to be able to build what you need on top of it. The other side of that responsibility model is on you in regards to how you set things up, how you're monitoring, such as doing the budget work or using what we call CloudWatch to watch those CPUs and RAM to fix whatever may be out of tune or what's going on. But as you have those instances up, you will be charged. You can always talk to support and see if that can be rectified or turned back. Doesn't happen often, but you could always ask. But it's really up to you to go ahead and make sure your environment is able to scale properly and alert you whenever something kind of goes off balance.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Sure.
I'm done with my questions. Thanks for letting me hog the floor there for a little bit.
There's one other thing I'll bring up, and we're very big on serverless. So I've been talking about serverless type work, a non-serverless type work, which is like EC2. You're standing up an instance, you're paying for it as you're using it. It stays up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're getting charged for that all the time, right? So we have also what we call a serverless approach. And the serverless approach is where you start using solutions like Lambda. Lambda, for those who aren't aware, is a serverless solution for compute where you can deploy a piece of code that will run on demand. So if Nolan, you're hitting it for 10, 15 minutes, you're going to get charged for that time, right? I will, and it's my solution, right? You're using it. I will be charged for you using it for that period of time. But once you're done using it, it'll go and turn itself off and you won't be charged. So it's only being used and you're only being charged as users are actually using this Lambda endpoint. And what you can do with Lambda, and this is where we get into more of an instantly scaling approach, is remember I talked about EC2 and that you have to do horizontal scaling to make sure that instances continue to come up as new users come in. With Lambda, what you can do is you can, instead of having an API on the server that's being utilized, you can use what we call our API gateway, which is a serverless RESTful interface endpoint that you can do your CRUD work, so create, read, update, deletes, and those endpoints will back to Lambda functions. And as requests come in, you're getting charged for the requests coming in, you're getting charged for the time being used for Lambda, and then that's it. Once it's done, it ends up turning itself off. It goes into an idle state for about 5 minutes. And if it's not being touched again, it turns itself off until the next request comes in, and then it'll spin back up and you'll start getting your requests. So for small applications, light workloads, that's a way that you can get started without having to worry about actually standing up instances and paying for them 24 hours a day, right?
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Sure.
Angus had a question in the chat real quick. He said, very roughly, what is the sweet spot for CPU and RAM?
That is a loaded question. So basically, it comes down to your workload. Quite literally, it comes down to the size of your workload. So when you have, let's say, we talked about a WordPress environment, right? and you have 10, 15, 20 people using it, you can get a small server. You can get one with 2 CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM, or 1 CPU, 4 gigs of RAM, and that'll probably be fine because you're not getting a lot of traffic. It doesn't need a lot of horsepower. But once your traffic starts to increase and you get hundreds or thousands of users, you're going to want to increase the size of that instance. And you can literally just change the size of an instance to have more memory and more CPU. And it'll be a brief downtime, but it'll switch your instance and it'll actually give you that larger instance instead that can handle a larger workload or more users. So again, it really comes down to the size of your workload and what you're doing. Some workloads are just actually asking for simple information like an image or just showing text in a post. It's a very light workload, just asking information from the database and it's showing. But then other solutions actually allow the ability to upload content and then curate that content on demand as it's happening. And that takes CPU horsepower, that takes memory, things along those lines. So depending on what you're doing, impacts the size of the instance that you need. And normally you'll start seeing this happen as you're building your workload. You'll go onto an instance. Usually I would recommend with anything you're running, you're testing with, start with a small instance, what we call a micro or small instance. Those are your least spends. And then run your workload, see how well it performs. Do a pen test on it or just a slight load test on it to make sure A, it's secure for the pen test, and B, to see if it handles traffic for up to 10 people. And if it does, then you can sit there and then you can put in those alarms, like I've mentioned in CloudWatch, to let you know that if CPU reaches 80%, and it stays at 80%, then that means you need to go back in and take a look at your workload and consider upgrading and putting that instance up to a higher figure. So to a 2 CPU, 8 GP, medium or large instance. Does that answer your question? Okay.
He says, thanks. I guess so. Does AWS have pen test and load test services baked into it? So I can just check a box and say, please pen test this EC2 instance for me?
Not at the moment. No, we don't have anything like that at the moment. No. So you would be using you use a third-party service to go ahead and pen test around. You can use, I think, was it Postman has a solution that you can use that actually can do a small test against an environment. Comes at a small cost, if I recall. And then you could just do simple pen tests around. You can also use, it's a JavaScript product that you can actually download locally. I'm just blanking on it. JMeter. It's an old, if y'all remember JMeter, you can use JMeter and you could basically specify, here's an endpoint, here's an endpoint, here's a payload. I want you to send 100 requests simultaneously to this endpoint for a period of time. And then you can run those yourself. Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure. So
any other questions for Pat? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, any questions, so you beat me to it. Okay. So I'll speak a little bit about some of the other services that we have, and then talk a little bit more about AWS in general. So about AWS, I'll just throw it in now. We have what we call leadership principles, which try to lean on as many things that are customer obsessed. So the number one leadership principle that we follow is called customer obsession. And what that's about is being able to do and work with our customers to where they're at in their business, and then get feedback from them to help improve on our services. So I brought up Lambda. Lambda is actually one of the services that didn't exist until we had deep conversations with the customer where they're asking for something like, I would like an environment where I can stand up compute and not manage it. I don't want to manage it. I don't want to deal with that stuff. I just want to do small workloads. I want to do microservices. I want to do these little small compute times, and I don't want to have to stand up instances or anything along those lines. So we heard that from the customer, found it as a great idea, and built Lambda. So the customer obsession approach is all about like what's happening with our customers, and then being able to use that information to make our products better. So over the last couple of years since I've been here, AWS has been really hyper-focusing on the serverless aspect. So there's now Lambda, which is serverless. There is what we call Aurora, which is a RDS, that database service that I mentioned, which has a serverless entity to it. It can scale up and scale down for you. So you don't have to worry about instance utilization. It just handles the work for you. We also do containerization for those who are here that understand Docker. So building up a container. We have a solution called, we have two of them actually. We have actually a number, but the two major ones that we work with is called ECS. ECS is called Elastic Container Service. And then one is called EKS, which is Elastic Kubernetes Service. But underneath those, you can stand up instances that run your cluster, or you can use what we call Fargate, which is a serverless approach. So you basically say, I want to make sure I just have X amount of CPUs available. I want to have this much RAM available. And under the hood, it'll handle giving you that resource. It'll handle giving you that much capacity for your compute. So you don't have to worry about managing the instances underneath. So we're going very much into a very serverless approach with the mind of folks like yourself who are doing development work, don't want to have to worry about infrastructure, but do need to worry about scaling. So all those things kind of start coming together so that you could start taking advantage of those type of solutions here. One thing I will call out, and it's a fun service if you're not familiar with, it's called Amplify, which is here at AWS. Amplify is used very much by anybody who wants to start a mobile application. So think about instead of setting up a CDN and deploying code, or needing to build an API endpoint for your front end code that you're building, or a database such as DynamoDB or relational database, Amplify allows you to do that pretty quickly. And Amplify, what it comes with is a CLI you download, and it basically, when you set it up, you initialize Amplify, and it'll start asking you a series of questions. Like, what is this workload? Are you building in React? Are you building in iOS? Are you building in Android? Like, what are you building in? And then what it'll do is it'll build out a boilerplate code block and code repository local to you that you can start developing in. And then once that's done, you can instantly deploy through the command line up to our CDN, which is CloudFront that I mentioned, and S3, where it would actually store static content. So think of the code you're building, you're compiling it, and now it's being deployed and served somewhere publicly so people can see it. So Amplify helps with that. Amplify also helps with building out those endpoints in the API gateway that I mentioned, like those RESTful endpoints in case you need to talk to a data store, but you need an API endpoint to do so. So Amplify will also help there. And it'll also help build up those Lambda scripts and Lambda functions that I mentioned in case you want to have an endpoint that does something CRUD specific to read data, write data, whatever you may need to do with that endpoint. You can build it locally in Lambda in your local environment, test it, and then you can use Amplify to deploy it to the AWS environment without having to, again, going in and standing all those things up yourself. You can literally do this through a command line, which is actually pretty cool. And that's constantly growing. And there's a lot of different other aspects that come with this, such as being able to do basic analytic work, capture events, similar like what you mentioned, Noel, like Google Analytics. We have something called Pinpoint, and you can basically submit events over to Pinpoint, and it'll give you insights about what's going on with your customers and the events that you've sent across. Also with machine learning and things along those lines. So it's kind of light and a lift to kind of get you in the door with some of the common services that you would use for AWS if you're just starting to build a workload. And then once you mature and you grow further from there, you may step back from Amplify. You may want to think about other aspects if you're maybe going into a SaaS-ish model, so sales as a service, and being able to expand a little further. But Amplify gives you a great avenue to get started from. I'll go ahead and share that with you here. There's a link to Amplify for you. So there's a lot of services, and I'm kind of listening to what you said, Eric, about we have so many services that keep coming out. 100 a year. Usually it's minimum 100 plus a year. And they usually come after reInvent. And we do, because we do events throughout the year. And reInvent is one that we do at the tail end of the year, where we do announcements of new services and new ways that you can use AWS. And that's when a lot of those new services come out. But we always have new services coming out. So I've went through a lot. And I try not to go too deep into too many services because it can get a little overwhelming, but there's a lot that you can do here. I would say use reposts to go ahead and ask questions about like, how would I get started with this type of architecture? And they, a solutions architect may come in and say, take a look at this blog post, take a look at this video, take a look at this approach and see if that works for you. You can have a conversation back and forth, at least in the thread, to get things moving. And then you can start standing things up on your own. And you can always come back and say, I want to be able to do something new, just describe whatever that is. Or if you're having a pain point with an environment, and someone there will be able to help you kind of get an answer.
Cool. Thank you very much, Pat. Appreciate it.
Sure. There are other angles which I can go into. I'll just kind of ramble through them and one at a time and just do a thumbs up. And if you're interested, I'll talk about them. So I talked a lot about the technical aspect of things, but AWS is very keen, again, on that customer obsession work. So when it comes to what we can do for you as a business, we have other levers that we can actually pull with you and help you move through. So one is we have the AWS Marketplace. Is anybody here familiar with the AWS Marketplace? A little bit. Okay. So the AWS Marketplace is somewhere where you can go to find pre-built environments. So think, again, WordPress. You want to stand up a WordPress environment. You can go there and get a vetted WordPress environment and instantly stand it up without having to install WordPress yourself. It'll just stand it up on an EC2 instance of your choice of size, and then you'll have the environment ready for you to go. So it gives you the ability to stand up common workloads, common solutions that you may want to have in your environment without you having to do it yourself. There's also paid type of environments there as well. So for instance, a lot of folks use what we call load balancers. Load balancers are there to divide traffic. So when I talked about that horizontal scaling that happens and you have 10, 20, 30 instances up and running, you're going to need to load balance that at that point. And that's where a load balancer comes in. It sits in front. And we call it an elastic load balancer. So all traffic comes in here. And then all of these other servers that are underneath are connected to it. And the load balancer's responsibility is to direct traffic to the instance that has the least amount of traffic, or what we call round robin as well, which is basically the next one in line. It just sends requests over. So it lightens the load on your servers. Instead of having 100 requests and you have on one server, instead you have 10 servers and they only handle 10 requests. So it helps to scale that out and give you that kind of elasticity that you're looking for. But that load balancer comes in different varieties. So one is called F5. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a very well-known load balancer that's used for high yield type of traffic dispersity. And in Marketplace, you can go and ask to stand up a load balancer that's an F5 load balancer. So you can have it available for your workload. So it gives you a lot of great ability to be able to choose specific configurations that are, again, vetted by the F5 folks, by WordPress, by other well-known companies that actually handle these pieces of software, and then you can deploy them into your environment. So it's a great way to kind of get started as well and lighten the lift to get things moving. And again, it'll go through and tell you like how much it would cost, but really what you're going to be paying for is what you are running on. So what size of instance you're running on and so on. The software is just what we call an AMI, which is a machine learning image, or not machine learning image. It's a virtual image of an EC2 instance with WordPress on it. And all it's going to do is put it on an instance size of your choosing and spin the whole thing up. And then it'll give you some instructions on how to set up like the password for WordPress, how to set up where the database needs to go and point to it, things along those lines. So Marketplace has a lot of different offerings that you can always look into, kind of see what's going on. Another angle that we have is for customers that are in AWS and want to grow in AWS. If you want to migrate, you have a workload that's in a colo and you're ready to move to cloud, or you're in another cloud and you want to move to AWS. If you're connected with a solutions architect and an account manager, it depends on your workload, depends on what you want to bring across. You can be eligible for credits. And basically we do something called MAP, which is a migration credit program. So depending on the size of your workload, depending on where you need to go, depending on what you're sharing with us about like what you're doing and where you are wanting to go, we may be able to apply credits to help get you over to AWS. So as a business, we help you to actually succeed and move into our environment where it makes sense, depending on where you are in your business. A part of that is where we have a partners network. So we have different partners, and these are specialists that are not in AWS. These are vetted companies that have gone through AWS best practices and can help you to actually stand up workloads that you need assistance with. So solutions architects, they're not hands-on keyboard. I don't actually go into customer environments and do the work. We don't do that. We have partners that do that. So you can use a partner to come in, help you understand what they do. You help them understand what kind of workload you want to build up. And then they'll have development resources that can help build out your workload and help you deploy it into AWS. So we have different type of partners around the world that can help you with those type of things. So on a business front with AWS, we're always thinking about like, where can we help you kind of fill a gap? Where can we help you move into the right environment? And then what type of programs make sense that you can be a part of to help you start increasing velocity? Because one of the main things here at AWS is that we are very big on what we like to do is optimization. Right now in the economy, it's kind of crappy, right? It's not doing well. You know, stuff's happening with startups. You've heard things happening at AWS. You've heard things happening at Google, everywhere. Layoffs are happening. All these things are happening. People are tightening their belts. So one of the things that we hyper focus on, which leans in onto that cost optimization leadership principle, is to help our customers optimize. So we'll talk about ways that they can spend less at AWS. And there's some things that you can remember, I'll share with you here, that you can use in order to do so. So for instance, we've talked about EC2. EC2 has what we call x86 instances. These are Intel-based processors that you would normally stand up. Very, very commonplace. But we also have a solution called Graviton. And Graviton is an ARM-based processor, not an Intel-based processor, but an ARM-based processor. And what that does is it can help you save on CPU time. And the reason why we do this is because we built these machines. These are EC2 instances that AWS has built from the ground up. It's our silicon. We do this, and the savings from us being able to build these and give them in the hands of the customer, we're giving you that savings. So if you go through the message I just sent to you, you'll see it starts talking about ways that you can optimize different instance types, but you can save a percentage of spend just by using a Graviton instance instead of an x86 instance. And the Graviton instances are available on EC2. They're available in RDS. They're available on the common stacks that you would normally want to use. So if you're wanting to start a workload, I normally tell my customers, start with a Graviton instance first, because it'll really give you that available and cost savings. There are two other things that you can do with cost optimization. I think it's important for y'all to know these things. The first is we have what we call savings plans. And this is another lean in on that cost optimization or customer obsession principle. So think about if you're in AWS and you have a workload that's pretty commonly running for a period of time, and you have it, you know you're going to have this thing running for the next 2 to 5 years, right? You just have this common workload. What you can do is you can apply what we call as a savings plan. And the savings plan is a committal approach to how much CPU you plan on spending for that period of time. And there's different variations you can do it. And it starts with 1 year. And I believe it goes up to 5 years. So you can do a 1-year savings plan and go ahead and start getting savings right away. I'll go ahead and send this over here as well. And when you stand that up, there's 2 varieties. Actually, there's multiple varieties, but there's 2 core varieties. There's an EC2 savings plan. And the EC2 savings plan lets you apply and get you the best savings, but it'll allow you to go ahead and do it on a specific EC2 instance and family, okay? But if you do the other one, which is a compute savings plan, then it spans them all. So if you want to, for instance, up the level of the instance size, you want to do it in multiple regions, you have instances of multiple regions, you want to apply for the savings plan, the compute savings plan allows that. Plus the saving plan goes against Lambda and Fargate as well, which are those serverless aspects that I mentioned that we also have here. So savings plan is also something worth doing. Normally what I tell customers that are just starting out is do the 1-year savings plan, do the minimum at first, just start getting that savings right away. You could always reapply a savings plan later, but you're just limiting your commit and getting savings. And as you grow and you start seeing that you have an impactful product, things are going well, and you want to be able to save even more, then commit to a 5-year. Go up to a 5-year plan, and then you'll be able to save on that front. So we give you the ability to choose how you may want to save. The other approach is what we call reserved instances. Reserved instances are basically the same as savings plans. Let me pull it up here. Basically, reserved instances are not specified to a broad stroke of instance types, like I mentioned with compute, or a specific in EC2 when it comes to a general savings plan. Reserved instances go a little deeper. You can actually reserve an instance for a period of time, like 1 year or 5 years, or a count of instances that you're going to use. And basically what you're saying is, for this time, you will be using these instances, and you're going to get the most savings by going and using reserved instance during that time. And that also ensures that you're going to always have that instance available to you going forward. Because as you can guess, at AWS, we have tons of servers, tons of virtual machines. Some virtual machines are in more demand than others. So we have what we call a 24x GN, I'm just blanked on the whole name of it, but it's basically it's a ton of CPUs, tons of memory, tons of space for doing things like rendering, right? So I don't know if you all know, but at Amazon, so if you saw the recent Avatar was rendered at Amazon. That's where it was rendered. And they use those large instances to do that work. But because they're so large, there's not going to be a wide variety of them. There's not going to be a huge count. But if you need one of those, and you need it for a long workload or for a long period of time, you can reserve one, and then it's yours. It's yours to use during that time. So we give you the levers. This is that shared responsibility. We'll set it up. And then here are some ways that you can go ahead and kick things off and save at the same time. So circling back to the economy, because where we are today, focus on if you're building up anything in the cloud. If you're doing it in Azure, you're doing it in GCP, do the same thing. Look at savings plans and what they may have there and what we have here, reserved instances, and then look at using the serverless capacity or serverless approach that I mentioned, because you'll bring down that cost and you'll extend your runway for your product. Anything else that any other questions? I'm curious, like, if anybody had like a workload that they thought of and they're like, hey, I'm thinking about building something of X, Y, or Z, and here's what I'm thinking, what would I use? I can go through and I can share like what you could use from beginning to end of what something like that can look like. It's part of one of the things that we do here at AWS. We do architectural reviews with our customers, help them understand like what they can build and where they can build into. Does anybody here have any ideas about something that would be kind of a cool something? It could be something rival to Netflix, right? It could be whatever you may want, but any ideas?
Feel free to unmute your microphone and ask away. Or just post in the chat and I'll read the questions from there. I think you stunned everybody, Pat. They're all just, I know my brain is swirling of like, oh my gosh, I have so many ideas now, things I want to, not questions to ask directly, but things like, I'd completely forgotten about Amplify. Like I've looked at it very, very briefly a number of months ago, went, oh yeah, that's cool. And forgot about it until you mentioned it again today. I went, oh, right, that's right. I got to check that out and see what I can do with Amplify more.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a ton. And I was telling Eric here, Nolan, I always get that mixed up sometimes. I think I did that last time we first met. I think I called you Eric. But basically, I'm happy to come back and do another chat. If you all find that you want to dive in on any of these things, you want to ask some more questions, I'm happy to come back. Again, I am a solutions architect manager. I know all the ins and outs. and I can kind of direct in something. And even if it's to a point where if there's a session about a workload you'd like to unpack, happy to do that with you to kind of give you some ideas of what's possible.
I'm certain you and I will chat later about new dates on the calendar for other more in-depth conversations. Angus has his hand up for a question. Go for it, Angus.
Thanks. This is probably super basic, but most of my clients, I do front-end web stuff. Most of my clients are on shared hosting. And when I've looked at AWS before, it seemed like overkill for most of them. I've had a few on EC2, I think. And then recently I had one, I think it was Lightsail.
Mm-hmm.
And wasn't sure what the difference was. Looked like Lightsail was maybe a scaled down version of what EC2 offers.
Yeah, Lightscale is a little more of a managed solution. EC2 gives you the all access to your instance on what you want to do, while Lightsail kind of has a little more of a managed spin to it. There's a couple of additives that come with it. Many folks do use Lightsail. Some customers actually use what we also call Elastic Beanstalk. Have you heard of Elastic Beanstalk before?
Just heard of it. I don't know much about it.
Okay. So Elastic Beanstalk simply stands up a simple environment for you and helps you scale without you having to do much. It's actually a really great service. Tons of customers use it. And think about, you stand up a workload, you want to be able to host it somewhere. You can use Amazon Elastic Beanstalk to go ahead and say, I want to have this type of compute available. I want to be able to do these things. This is the type of environment that it's going to be. It's going to run Python. It's going to run some type of running engine based off of what Beanstalk can do. And then it handles the scalability for you. So I talked about that elasticity. I talked about the load balancing. I've talked about general metrics, things like that. All that's baked into Elastic Beanstalk. So, and that is a collection of some of the services that we do have. So you don't have to worry about managing that. It can do that for you. So some customers who come in that are very new to a workload, a shared environment, I'll say right now, if you're using like DigitalOcean or something along those lines, that's going to be your cheapest bet. That's going to be very, very cheap because you're in a shared environment. Maybe you have your own, maybe you don't have a droplet, or if you're going to be using some, what is it? It's not Drupal. That's totally different. But is it Blue something for WordPress? Help me out here. Anybody know? Okay. So I'm just forgetting on the name, but basically that's a shared environment. You want to set up WordPress, you can could do it over there. You can do a shared environment, or you can do a dedicated environment. But at AWS, you're standing up your own environment from scratch. You're going to be maintaining it. It is yours. It is what you want to stand up. It is not a shared solution. It is not on a shared environment where there are noisy neighbors or anything along those lines. But again, if you write Sizewell and you come in, you can start with a small instance and pay pretty cheaply for it. I mean, it could go to 50, 70, $100 a month, depending on what you want. Could even be lower, but it really depends on the size that you're starting with and how much you're turning on at AWS. Normally, customers who start up first, they'll start with a small instance. They'll stand it up directly to the EC2 endpoint, install everything they need there. They will not use a load balancer. They will not use a CDN. They will not use other services. They'll even install the database on that actual server. And that's fine. You could totally just start there. And then the magic of what AWS has to offer is you can start right there. And then as you mature and you start saying, well, things are getting overloaded, I'm getting more traffic. All right, let's now move the database to something like RDS or a separate server. Or, I need to be able to scale. Okay, let's go ahead and just slide in an EC2, an ELB, a load balancer in front of it. I want to be able to now do static edge caching. Okay, let's start putting in CloudFront. So it gives you that ability to turn things on that other hosted providers don't do.
Great, thanks. That helps.
Sure. But again, like that Amplify one that I talked about and Nolan was talking about, that's pretty low lift. And you're running in a serverless environment for the most part. You're when you're building out and compiling your work and it goes into S3, S3 is the cheapest storage that we have here at AWS. So you're not going to pay much, especially if it's just a little bit of code. You could then use CloudFront if you want. or you can go directly against S3. We encourage folks to use CloudFront. It's very, very cheap, and it gives you that scalability that you need and that caching you may want. And then it'll, again, like I talked about with Amplify, it'll stand up a Lambda endpoint. And you're not paying for an instance anymore. You're paying for just the utilization of Lambda. And then you're just worrying about paying as you go. You're not worrying about long idle times of workloads, and that helps get you going. So if you have, again, a small workload, going that direction can save you more than potentially going into a hosted shared environment, because in a shared environment, you still are going to be paying a specific fee for the entire month. When in something like Lambda, you could be spending a lot less because you just don't have a lot of traffic yet.
Definitely lots of good stuff to check out later.
Yeah. I can go a lot deeper. There's a lot of stuff.
We could probably go all night, I'm sure, but I don't want to abuse your time nor keep any of the folks on here up super late. I know we have a couple people that are not West Coasters and they're dialing in from pretty late at night time zones already. But does anyone else have more questions for Pat while we've got him here? Stunned silence all across the board.
Yeah.
Sir.
Well, Nolan knows how to find me. So if you have any questions, you just reach out to him and then he can find me.
Yeah,
but I'm happy to help answer anything you have. If you feel free to share my LinkedIn with them, Nolan. And then you could always ping me directly on LinkedIn. I'm pretty responsive. If I can find something, you have a question and I can find a quick answer, I'll share it and I'll give you some direction.
Cool.
But it's always fun to get inside of cloud and being able to see what's possible, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of services, there's a lot possible.
Right. Thank you very much, Pat. This is awesome. Lots of new stuff to check out. And thank you everyone else for dialing in. Like I mentioned before, we meet the third Wednesday of the month here in Zoom. It's always free. It's always open to whoever wants to join. You can find us at sacinteractive.com. We're also on Twitter and the Facebooks. And I post on meetup.com anytime we have a meeting. We'll get the recording of this up on YouTube soon to give a nice vague answer. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining. And Pat, thank you again. That was fantastic.